Russia just lost Eastern Europe, and it happened without a single shot being fired. I know that sounds like an overstatement. I know you've watched Eastern Europe get called a turning point a dozen times in the last 4 years. But what happened on April 8, 2026 is different. What President Maia Sandu signed into law that morning didn't just redraw a political map. It erased the last legal architecture holding Russia's post-Soviet empire together, at least in Europe. And it did something else. Something Moscow has been quietly terrified of for 30 years. It made Transnistria irrelevant. Stay with me because this story is not what it looks like on the surface. This is Iron Dispatch, and if geopolitics moves this fast in the weeks ahead, you'll want to be subscribed before the next domino falls. On the surface, this looks like a bureaucratic story. A small Eastern European nation withdrawing from an outdated post-Soviet club called the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. A loose, largely ceremonial organization that Russia has used not as a governing body, but as a leash. A soft instrument of control dressed up in diplomatic language. Moldova joining it after 1991 was never truly voluntary. It was the cost of survival. But here's what most coverage gets completely wrong. Moldova didn't just leave a club. Moldova legally severed the last formal institutional thread connecting it to Moscow's sphere of influence. After April 8, 2026, there is no treaty framework, no mutual defense clause, no economic dependency agreement under the CIS umbrella that Russia can point to as justification for its presence in Moldovan affairs. The legal exits have been welded shut, from Moldova's side. And that changes everything about what comes next. Let's go back, because Transnistria doesn't make sense without history. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Moldova emerged as an independent state. But independence came with a complication. A thin strip of land on the eastern bank of the Dniester River, sandwiched between the river and the Ukrainian border, refused to follow. Transnistria declared itself a separate republic. Moscow backed it. And in 1992, a brief but bloody war cemented the arrangement. Russian troops moved in under the banner of the Operational Group of Forces. They've been there ever since. Roughly 1,500 soldiers. Not enough to invade, exactly enough to freeze the conflict. Exactly enough to make Moldova think twice before moving too decisively toward Europe. That was the strategy. Not conquest, paralysis. For 30 years, Transnistria served as Moscow's instrument of strategic ambiguity in Eastern Europe. A splinter state with no international recognition, no NATO membership, and no EU protection, but full Russian military presence. A pressure valve Moscow could tighten whenever Moldova drifted too far west. It was a masterclass in low-cost leverage. One frozen conflict, zero direct confrontation, maximum political disruption. And now that model is collapsing. Rapidly, structurally, possibly irreversibly. Here's the part nobody is talking about. It isn't Moldova that broke Transnistria, it's geography. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it made a calculation error that would take years to fully materialize. By losing control of southern Ukraine, failing to capture Odessa, failing to push through Mykolaiv, Russia severed its own land corridor to Transnistria. Every supply line, every reinforcement route, every logistical thread connecting Moscow to its 1,500 soldiers in that narrow strip of land was cut. Not by Moldova, not by NATO, by Russia's own failed military campaign next door. Kirilo Budanov, head of Ukraine's presidential office, said it plainly. The Russian contingent in Transnistria is now extremely weak, and reinforcing it is physically impossible. That's not a threat or a warning. That's a military assessment. Those 1,500 soldiers are not a garrison anymore. They are, increasingly, hostages to their own isolation. And the economics? Those have collapsed too. Transnistria's survival model was built on one thing: selling electricity. The Kuchergan power plant, running on cheap Russian gas, generated electricity and sold it to Moldova proper. It was Transnistria's primary revenue stream, the economic lifeblood that funded the entire fiction of a functioning statelet. That arrangement is now gone. The gas stopped flowing. The plant has been reduced to burning coal. The revenue has evaporated. And without that revenue, the social contract holding Transnistria's population in place, subsidized utilities, cheap goods, Russian pensions, starts to crack. Let's talk about the arsenal, because this is where things get genuinely alarming. At a facility called Cobasna, in northern Transnistria, Russia maintains what may be the largest ammunition depot in Europe. Approximately 20,000 tons of heavy munitions, artillery shells, tank ammunition, small arms rounds, left behind from the Soviet 14th Army at the end of the Cold War. That stockpile was always described as a bargaining chip, Russia's implicit threat. This depot doesn't leave peacefully unless we get what we want. Here's the number that changes this entire story: 57%. Analysts estimate that 57% of the Cobasna stockpile has exceeded its shelf life. The ammunition is degrading. The storage conditions, which have never been maintained to modern safety standards, are worsening. Some experts have suggested that if Cobasna were to catastrophically detonate, accidentally or otherwise, the explosion would be comparable in destructive scale to a small nuclear device. Not nuclear radiation, not a nuclear weapon, but an explosion large enough to level the surrounding region, shatter windows across a wide radius, and render the area uninhabitable. Russia knows this. Moldova knows this. What's changed is that Moldova has decided to stop letting that knowledge paralyze it. Sergei Shoigu, now serving as Secretary of Russia's Security Council, has already started playing this card. He issued statements claiming that Russian citizens in Transnistria face danger, that Moldova is systematically squeezing Russian forces, and that Moscow reserves the right to use, quote, all necessary methods. It's the same language Russia used before every intervention in every frozen conflict it has managed for 30 years. The language of manufactured emergency. Sergei Lavrov called the Romania Moldova reunification scenario a destructive plan aimed at eliminating the Moldovan state. That word choice is deliberate. Russia's diplomatic messaging is no longer focused on Transnistria as a strategic asset. It's focused on framing Moldova's legitimate political choices as acts of aggression. Because when you've lost the strategic argument, you shift to the moral one. Now let's talk about the scenario that is quietly being discussed in Chisinau, in Bucharest, and in Brussels, and loudly avoided everywhere else. Reunification. Maia Sandu didn't dance around it. She said, plainly, that if a referendum were held on unification with Romania, she would vote yes, without hesitation. That is a sitting head of state declaring her personal position on the dissolution of her own country's current borders. Diplomatically, that is extraordinary. It tells you something important about where Moldova's trajectory is pointing. Romania and Moldova share a language. They share a history. Before World War II, they shared a border, and the land that is now Moldova was Romanian territory, seized by the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The cultural case for reunification is not new. The political case is becoming harder to dismiss. If Moldova formally unifies with Romania, it does not just become part of a neighboring country. It becomes part of a NATO member state. It becomes part of the European Union. Every square kilometer of Moldovan territory, including potentially Transnistria, would fall under Article 5 protection and EU jurisdiction overnight. Transnistria's 1,500 Russian soldiers would not be in a frozen conflict zone anymore. They would be inside the borders of a NATO country. The entire strategic logic of the statelet collapses at that moment. Not gradually, instantly. This is why Lavrov called it destructive, because it is, for Russia. The European Union understands this calculus perfectly. Brussels has committed billions of euros to Moldova's transformation. Military modernization, cybersecurity infrastructure, institutional reform, energy independence. Every euro is designed to accomplish the same thing. Make Moldova functional enough, secure enough, and European enough that the question of reunification becomes a genuine democratic choice rather than a desperate one. The EU isn't forcing reunification. It's making it possible for Moldovans to want it freely. That's a more sophisticated intervention than anything Russia has attempted in the region in a decade. Here's what this moment really is, underneath the headlines. It's not a military story. It's a story about the shelf life of leverage. Russia's entire Eastern European strategy since 1991 was built on leveraging frozen conflicts, energy dependence, and institutional entanglement to keep neighboring states too complicated, too divided, and too afraid to move decisively westward. That strategy required the conflicts to stay frozen. It required the energy pipelines to keep flowing. It required the CIS to remain a meaningful institution. One by one, over the course of 4 years of war in Ukraine, each of those pillars has cracked. The gas stopped. The pipelines became liabilities. Ukraine's battlefield performance made Russian military credibility collapse. And now, on April 8, 2026, Maia Sandu signed the last legal pillar away. What's left in Transnistria is not a strategy. It's a relic. 1,500 isolated soldiers, a degrading ammunition depot that nobody can safely move, and a population that has watched its subsidized lifestyle disappear along with the gas supply. Russia cannot reinforce them. Russia cannot negotiate their dignified exit without implicitly conceding the entire 30-year project was a failure. And Russia cannot make a military move, because the only routes to Transnistria run through Ukraine, and Ukraine is not going to allow that. Putin is not just losing a frozen conflict. He is watching the architecture of an entire era dissolve in real time, and he cannot stop it. The questions that remain are not small ones. What happens to the Cobasna ammunition depot? And who takes responsibility for the 20,000 tons of degrading Soviet munitions that no one wants to move and everyone should be afraid to leave? What does Russia do when the last of its leverage is gone? Does it escalate rhetorically? Does it find a new frozen conflict elsewhere? Or does it simply absorb the humiliation? What does reunification actually look like, legally and politically, if Moldovans vote for it? And what happens to the Transnistrian population that has lived under a Russian-backed administration for 3 decades? These are not hypotheticals. These are the questions that will define the next chapter of Eastern Europe's political map. The frozen conflict model is thawing, not because NATO pushed it, not because the United States intervened, because Moldova, a country of fewer than 3 million people, without a significant military, without nuclear weapons, without a seat on the Security Council, chose to sign a piece of paper. And that piece of paper, on April 8, 2026, did more damage to Russia's position in Eastern Europe than any missile strike could have. That is the lesson here. That is what makes this story worth your full attention. The world keeps expecting the decisive moment to arrive with jets and artillery. But the decisive moment arrived with a pen. And Russia, for all its warnings and all its language about necessary methods, had no answer for it. Watch this space. Because Moldova isn't done, Romania isn't done, and the question of what becomes of that thin strip of land along the Dniester and the 1,500 soldiers trapped inside it is going to have an answer sooner than anyone in Moscow would like. If you want to be there when it does, subscribe. Hit the bell, because the next chapter of this story is already moving.